Good evening all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight we are traveling north to the isolated plains and forgotten corners of Alberta, where small towns hide secrets darker than the long winter nights. 10 true stories wait for you, each one more disturbing than the last. These are not legends passed down through generations. These are real encounters from real people who came face to face with evil in places where help is miles away and screams go unheard. From abandoned mines that conceal unspeakable crimes to farmhouses with blood-soaked histories, from creatures that should not exist to disappearances that defy explanation, Alberta's small towns have witnessed horrors that will chill you to your core. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of Alberta's forgotten towns, where civilization ends and terror begins. It was a Thursday afternoon in late September when I made the drive out to the old family property near Hanna, Alberta. The town itself had a population of barely 2,000 people, and my grandfather's farm sat another 15 kilometers outside even that small hub of civilization. I had inherited the place 6 months earlier when he passed away, but between work and life in Calgary, I had not found the time to visit until now. The lawyer handling the estate kept pushing me to at least inspect the property before deciding whether to sell it or keep it. So I loaded up my truck with some basic supplies and made the 2-hour drive east across the prairies. The landscape out there is harsh and beautiful in equal measure. Endless fields of wheat and canola stretched to the horizon, broken only by the occasional cluster of trees or abandoned farmhouse. As I turned off the main highway onto the gravel road that led to the property, I felt a strange mixture of nostalgia and unease. I'd only visited the farm a handful of times as a child, and my memories of it were vague at best. My grandfather had been a solitary man, not given to hosting family gatherings or encouraging visits. My father rarely spoke about him, and when he did, there was always a tension in his voice that I never quite understood. The farmhouse came into view as I crested a small hill. It was a 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch. The barn behind it had partially collapsed, and tall weeds had overtaken what used to be the yard. I parked my truck near the front steps and sat there for a moment, taking it all in. The silence out here was absolute. No traffic sounds, no neighbors, nothing but the whisper of wind through the dry grass. It was the kind of quiet that made you aware of your own heartbeat. I grabbed my flashlight and toolkit from the truck and approached the house. The front door was unlocked, which surprised me until I realized that out here there was probably no one around for miles to worry about. The hinges groaned as I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was stale and thick with dust. Furniture sat covered in white sheets like ghosts frozen in time. I walked through the main floor, examining the kitchen, living room, and small bathroom. Everything was dated, probably unchanged since the 1970s, but structurally the house seemed sound enough. It was when I opened the door to the basement that I felt the first real stirring of unease. The stairs descended into darkness, and even with my flashlight, I could only see a few feet ahead. The air that drifted up from below was noticeably colder and carried a damp, earthy smell that made my stomach tighten. I had no logical reason to feel nervous. It was just an old basement. But something about it made me hesitate at the top of those stairs for a long moment before I forced myself to descend. The basement was unfinished, with concrete walls and a dirt floor in some sections. Old tools hung on the walls, and wooden shelves held dusty jars of preserved vegetables that must have been decades old. I swept my flashlight around the space, noting the low ceiling and the support beams that divided the area into smaller sections. That was when I noticed something odd. In the far corner, there was a door. Not a typical basement door, but something that looked newer, out of place among the aged surroundings. It was made of heavy wood and had a deadbolt lock on the outside. I approached it slowly, my footsteps echoing in the confined space. The door had no handle on this side, only the lock. I slid the deadbolt open and pulled. The door swung toward me with surprising ease, revealing a small room beyond. I shone my flashlight inside and felt my breath catch in my throat. The walls of the room were covered in newspaper clippings, dozens of them, yellowed with age and pinned haphazardly across every surface. I stepped inside and began to read them. They were all about the same case, a disappearance that had occurred in 1983. A young woman named Sarah Kowalski had vanished without a trace from a farm outside Hannah. She had been 22 years old. The articles detailed the search efforts, the investigation, the grief of her family. But there had never been any resolution. No body found, no suspects charged, no answers. My hands were shaking as I moved the flashlight across the walls. Why would my grandfather have this room? Why would he be obsessed with this case? I noticed other details then. Scratches on the door frame, deep gouges in the wood, modifications to the room itself. The walls had been reinforced with additional layers of wood paneling. There were metal brackets on the floor that looked like they had once held something in place. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to reject the obvious conclusion that kept forcing itself forward. I heard the sound from upstairs before I could process it fully. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floorboards of the main level. I froze, my flashlight beam locked on the newspaper clippings in front of me. Someone else was in the house. I had not heard a car approach. I had not heard the front door open. But someone was definitely up there, and they were moving toward the basement door. I switched off my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall of the small room, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might give me away. The footsteps reached the top of the basement stairs and stopped. I could hear breathing, steady and calm, not the breathing of someone who was startled or afraid. This person knew exactly where they were and what they were doing. Then the footsteps began descending the stairs, one slow step at a time. I had no weapon, no way to defend myself if this person meant me harm. My phone was in my pocket, but I had no service out here. I was completely alone with whoever this was. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and paused again. I could see the faint glow of a different flashlight playing across the basement walls through the crack in the door. Then a voice, male and rough with age, called out, "I know you're down here. I saw your truck outside." I did not respond. My mind was screaming at me to run, but there was no other exit from this room. The only way out was through the basement and up those stairs. I was trapped. "You must be the grandson," the voice continued. "I have been keeping an eye on this place since your grandfather passed, making sure no one disturbed anything important." The beam of his flashlight moved closer to the small room where I was hiding. I could see his shadow now, cast large and distorted on the concrete wall. He was a big man, and he moved with the careful deliberacy of someone who had done this before. "You found the room," he said, and now his voice was right outside the door. "That is unfortunate. Your grandfather and I had an understanding. He knew things about me, and I knew things about him. Mutually assured destruction, you might say. But you do not have that protection." He pushed the door open fully, and his flashlight beam found me immediately. He was older, probably in his 70s, with a weathered face and cold, calculating eyes. He was not holding a weapon that I could see, but his size alone was enough of a threat. I found my voice, though it came out weaker than I wanted. "What do you want?" He smiled, and it was not a kind expression. "I want you to understand that some things are better left buried. Your grandfather learned that lesson. He learned what happens in this area, what has always happened, and he learned to look the other way. That room you are standing in was his insurance policy. Evidence against me, kept safe in case I ever came after him. But he is gone now, and that changes things." "The girl," I said, the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. "Sarah Kowalski. You killed her, His smile widened. "Among others, this land is good for keeping secrets. Your grandfather knew about the first one, found what I had buried on the property line between his farm and mine. Instead of going to the police, he documented everything and built this little room. Told me that if anything ever happened to him, someone would find it and I would go to prison. So we had our arrangement. He stayed quiet and I stayed away from his family. I'm calling the police," I said, pulling my phone from my pocket even though I knew it was useless out here. He laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "No service, boy. We are too far from anything out here. That was always the beauty of it. I could do what I wanted, and no one would ever know. Your grandfather was smart enough to recognize that and make his peace with it. You should do the same." That was when I made my move. I threw my flashlight directly at his face as hard as I could and rushed past him while he recoiled. I heard him curse and stumble, but I did not look back. I ran for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, my lungs burning with the effort. Behind me, I could hear him recovering, starting to chase. His footsteps were heavy on the stairs, but I had a head start. I burst through the basement door into the main level and ran for the front door. My truck keys were in my pocket, my truck just 30 feet away across the overgrown yard. I could hear him behind me crashing through the house, shouting something I could not make out over the sound of my own panicked breathing. I hit the front porch at a full sprint and nearly fell down the steps, catching myself on the railing at the last second. My hands fumbled with the truck door, precious seconds lost as I yanked it open and threw myself inside. I jammed the key into the ignition and the engine roared to life. Through the windshield, I could see him emerging from the house, moving toward me with that same deliberate pace. He was not running anymore. He did not need to. He knew this land, knew every road and path for miles, but I had my truck, and I had momentum. I threw the transmission into reverse and floored the gas pedal. The truck shot backward, gravel spraying from the tires. I cranked the wheel and spun the vehicle around, then shifted into drive and accelerated down the long driveway. In my rear-view mirror, I could see him standing in the yard watching me go, his figure growing smaller, but never disappearing entirely until I crested the hill and lost sight of the property. I drove straight back to Calgary without stopping, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. Once I had cell service again, I pulled over and called the RCMP detachment in Hannah. I told them everything, about the room, the newspaper clippings, the man who had confronted me. I gave them directions to the property and a description of the man, though I realized I had never learned his name. The investigation that followed made regional news. Police excavated areas of my grandfather's property and the surrounding farms. They found remains, 3 sets of them, including Sarah Kowalski. The man was arrested 2 days later at his own farm, just 4 kilometers from my grandfather's place. His name was Douglas Peterson, and he had been a respected member of the community for over 50 years. The trial revealed the full extent of his crimes, spanning decades. My grandfather had indeed known, and had remained silent, bound by fear and perhaps some twisted sense of rural code that I will never understand. I sold the property immediately after the police finished their investigation. I could not bear the thought of ever returning there, of walking through that house knowing what my grandfather had allowed to continue. Some people in Hannah called me a hero for bringing the truth to light. Others, those who had known my grandfather, looked at me with resentment, as if I had betrayed some unspoken agreement. I still have nightmares about that basement room, about the newspaper clippings, and the cold certainty in Douglas Peterson's eyes when he told me some things are better left buried. But the worst part, the thing that truly haunts me, is the question I will never be able to answer. How many times had my grandfather gone down into that basement, opened that locked door, and looked at those clippings? How many times had he reassured himself that his silence was justified, that his family's safety was worth the price of letting a monster walk free? I will never know, and perhaps that is the most disturbing truth of all. I have always been a runner. Since high school, I've made it a habit to go for a jog at least 4 times a week, and when I moved to the small town of Vulcan, Alberta for a teaching position, I was thrilled to discover the trail system that wound through the countryside just outside of town. Vulcan is tiny, with fewer than 2,000 residents, but the people are friendly, and the cost of living allowed me to actually save money on a teacher's salary. The trails became my escape, my way of clearing my head after long days in the classroom. It was late August, that perfect time of year, when the summer heat had broken, but the autumn chill had not yet arrived. I had finished my run and was doing my cool-down walk along the section of trail that ran parallel to a dense cluster of trees. The sun was starting to sink lower in the sky, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. I had my earbuds in, listening to a podcast, feeling completely at peace with the world. That peaceful feeling would not last. I first noticed the sound when I paused the podcast to catch my breath. It was a strange noise, almost like a cough or a bark, but deeper and more guttural than anything I had heard from the coyotes that occasionally appeared in the area. I pulled out my earbuds and stood still, listening. The sound came again, this time from somewhere within the tree line to my left. It was definitely an animal, but I could not identify what kind. Growing up in suburban Edmonton, my knowledge of wildlife was limited to the occasional deer or rabbit. This sound was different. It was wrong somehow, in a way I could not articulate. I told myself it was probably nothing to worry about. Vulcan was farm country, and strange animal sounds were likely part of the territory. I put my earbuds back in and continued walking toward the parking area where I had left my car, but I had only taken a few steps when I saw movement in my peripheral vision. Something large was moving through the trees, keeping pace with me. I stopped again and turned to look directly at the tree line. For a moment, I saw nothing but shadows and branches. Then it moved again, and I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. It was big, easily the size of a large deer or elk, but it was not moving like any 4-legged animal I had ever seen. It was moving upright, on 2 legs, with a strange loping gait that looked both awkward and purposeful. I could not make out details through the trees, but I could see its silhouette clearly enough to know that whatever I was looking at should not exist. My rational mind tried to supply explanations. A person in a costume, a bear standing on its hind legs, anything that made sense. But none of those explanations felt right. I started walking faster, my eyes fixed on the tree line. The thing kept pace with me, moving parallel to the trail, never getting closer but never falling behind. My heart was pounding now, not from exertion but from pure animal fear. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I was still a quarter mile from the parking area, and I did not know if running would trigger some kind of chase response in whatever was following me. Then it made that sound again, that deep guttural noise that was part growl and part something else entirely. This time it was louder, more aggressive, and it came from much closer than before. I looked toward the tree line and saw that the thing had moved nearer to the trail. It was standing at the edge of the trees now, partially visible in the fading light. What I saw made my legs go weak. It was covered in dark fur or hair, matted and dirty looking. Its body was massively built, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung down past where its knees should be. But it was the eyes that terrified me most. They were reflecting the light, glowing with an amber color that was distinctly not human, and not quite animal either. They were fixed directly on me, unblinking, watching me with an intelligence that felt malicious. I did not make a conscious decision to run. My body simply took over, flooding with adrenaline, and I was sprinting down that trail faster than I had ever run in my life. Behind me, I heard crashing sounds as the thing entered the trail, no longer bothering to stay hidden in the trees. It was coming after me, and from the sound of its movement, it was fast, faster than I was. The trail curved ahead, and I knew that just around that bend was a steeper section that led down toward the parking area. If I could make it to my car, if I could just get inside and lock the doors, maybe I would be safe. I did not dare look back. I could hear it behind me, hear its breathing, heavy and labored but steady. The distance between us was closing. I rounded the curve and nearly fell as my foot caught on a root. I stumbled but managed to stay upright, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. The parking area came into view, my little blue sedan sitting alone in the gravel lot. I had never been so happy to see my car in my entire life. 50 yards, 40, 30. The thing behind me made that sound again so close now that I could feel it vibrate in my chest. 20 yards. I fumbled in my running belt for my keys, my fingers clumsy with fear. 10 yards. I could hear it right behind me now, could hear its footfalls on the gravel. 5 yards. I reached my car and jammed the key into the door lock, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. The lock clicked open and I threw myself inside, slamming the door behind me and immediately hitting the lock button. Only then did I look back at the trail. It was standing at the edge of the parking area, just where the trail met the gravel. In the better light of the open space, I could see it more clearly, and what I saw defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was easily 7 feet tall, maybe taller, with proportions that were disturbingly human-like but exaggerated. Its face was flat, almost ape-like, but with features that seemed wrong, asymmetrical. The eyes that had glowed in the forest were still fixed on me, still watching with that unsettling intelligence. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. Then, without any warning, it turned and loped back into the trees, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. I sat in my car, shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps, unable to process what had just happened. I drove back to my apartment in town with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers ached. I kept checking my rear-view mirror, expecting to see something following me, but the road behind me remained empty. When I got home, I locked every door and window, drew all the curtains, and spent the rest of the evening on my couch, trying to convince myself that I had somehow misidentified what I had seen. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe the light had played tricks on me. Maybe my fear had caused me to imagine details that were not really there. But I knew the truth. I knew what I had seen, and I knew it was not any animal I could explain away with rational thought. The next day, I made some careful inquiries at the school. I asked some of the other teachers, the ones who had lived in the area their whole lives, if there were any dangerous animals on the trails. They assured me that the worst I might encounter would be a coyote, or possibly a cougar, though cougar sightings were rare. I pressed a little harder, asked if anyone had ever reported seeing anything unusual. That was when I noticed the change in the room. The conversation, which had been light and casual, suddenly became awkward. People exchanged glances. One of the older teachers, a woman named Margaret, who had taught in Vulcan for over 30 years, quietly suggested we talk in her classroom. Once we were alone, Margaret closed the door and looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. It was part concern, part resignation, and part something else. Fear, maybe, or respect. "You saw it," she said. It was not a question. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Margaret sighed and sat down at her desk, gesturing for me to take a seat as well. "People around here do not talk about it much," she said. "Not with outsiders, anyway. But there is something in those woods. There has been for as long as anyone can remember. The old-timers, the farmers whose families have been here for generations, they all know. They have their own name for it, but I will not repeat it. Speaking the name is considered bad luck." "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "No one knows for sure," Margaret said. "Some think it is a bear or some kind of unknown animal. Others think it is something else, something that does not fit into our understanding of the natural world. What I can tell you is that people have been seeing it for decades, maybe longer, and the ones who see it, the ones who really see it up close like you did, They do not go back to those trails alone. Some of them leave town entirely. Has it ever hurt anyone? I asked. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Not that I know of, she finally said, but there have been disappearances over the years. Hikers who went out and never came back. Animals found torn apart in ways that do not match any predator we have in this region. Could be coincidence, could be something else. Most people do not want to know the answer. I thanked Margaret for her honesty and left her classroom feeling even more unsettled than before. The fact that other people had seen this thing, that it was a known presence in the area, somehow made it worse. It meant I had not imagined it. It meant it was real. I stopped running on those trails. I found a route through town instead, circling the streets during daylight hours, never venturing near the tree line. Some of my colleagues noticed the change and understood without me having to explain. They had seen the look in my eyes, the same look that others before me had probably worn. The look of someone who had encountered something they could not forget. Months passed, and life went on. I threw myself into my teaching, built friendships in town, tried to move past the experience. But I never truly forgot. How could I? On clear nights, when I would look out my apartment window toward the dark expanse of countryside beyond the town limits, I would sometimes see movement in the distance. Something large, moving at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. I'm still in Vulcan. I still teach at the same school, but I never go near those trails, and I never go out after dark unless absolutely necessary, because I know what is out there in those woods, even if I cannot explain it or name it. I know that there are things in this world that exist outside our understanding, creatures that inhabit the spaces between what we know and what we fear, and I know that it saw me just as clearly as I saw it. That on that late August evening we looked into each other's eyes and recognized something. I cannot say what it recognized in me, but what I recognized in it was simple and terrifying. It was aware, it was intelligent, and it did not want to be known. To this day, I cannot shake the feeling that it is still out there, moving through those trees, watching the trail for the next person who wanders too far from safety. I hope whoever that is, they are faster than I was. I hope they make it to their car in time, because I have the terrible suspicion that one day someone will not be so lucky. I moved to Drumheller, Alberta in March of 2023 for what I thought would be a fresh start. After a difficult breakup and a dead-end job in Vancouver, the opportunity to work as a junior geologist at the Royal Tyrrell Museum felt like exactly what I needed. Drumheller is a small town, population around 8,000, nestled in the heart of the Alberta Badlands. The landscape is otherworldly, all canyons and hoodoos, and layers of ancient rock that tell stories millions of years old. It was perfect for someone like me who wanted to lose himself in work and forget about the chaos of his previous life. I found a room to rent in an old house on the east side of town. The landlord was an elderly man named Mr. Henriksen, who lived on the main floor while renting out the 3 bedrooms on the second floor to various tenants. The rent was cheap, the room was furnished, and Mr. Henriksen seemed pleasant enough during our initial meeting. He explained that the house had been in his family since the 1940s, and that he preferred to rent to quiet, professional types. I assured him I fit that description perfectly. The first week went smoothly. I settled into my new job, explored the town, and began to feel like I had made the right decision in moving. My room was small but comfortable, with a window that looked out over the neighbor's yard and the coulees beyond. The other tenants kept to themselves. I would occasionally hear footsteps in the hallway or doors closing, but nothing out of the ordinary for a shared living situation. It was on my 8th day in the house that I first noticed something strange. I had come home from work around 6 in the evening and was heating up dinner in the small kitchen we shared on the second floor. As I stood at the microwave waiting for my food, I glanced at the clock on the wall. It read 6:17. When the microwave beeped a minute later, I looked at the clock again. It still read 6:17. I assumed the battery was dying and made a mental note to mention it to Mr. Henriksen. The next day, I experienced my first real moment of unease. I was getting ready for work in the morning, going through my usual routine. I made coffee, toasted a bagel, checked my phone for messages, standard morning activities. But as I was brushing my teeth, I had the strangest sensation of déjà vu. Not the mild kind where something feels vaguely familiar, but an intense, visceral certainty that I had already lived this exact moment. The angle of the light coming through the bathroom window, the taste of the toothpaste, the sound of a car starting outside. All of it felt like a perfect repetition of something that had already occurred. I shook it off as a side effect of stress or lack of sleep. But over the next few days, the feeling intensified. Small moments would trigger that same sense of repetition. A conversation with a coworker that I could have sworn we had already had, word for word. A commercial on television that I was certain I had seen the previous week, except the date in the corner showed it was a current broadcast. A song on the radio that I knew was about to play before the DJ announced it. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was paying closer attention to patterns than I realized. Maybe my subconscious was picking up on cues and making predictions that felt like memories. But the incidents kept happening, and they were becoming more specific and undeniable. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening. I had just returned from the grocery store and was unpacking my bags in the kitchen when one of the other tenants, a nurse named Patricia, came in to make tea. We had not spoken much since I moved in, just polite nods in passing. But that evening, she struck up a conversation about the weather, mentioning that the forecast called for snow later in the week. As she spoke, I had that sensation again, but stronger than ever before. I knew exactly what she was going to say next. Not a guess or a hunch, but absolute knowledge. She would mention that her daughter was visiting from Calgary this weekend. She would ask if I had any plans for the weekend. She would make a joke about how there was not much to do in Drumheller compared to Vancouver. And then she would look at the clock, say it was already 8:30, and head back to her room. And that is exactly what happened. Every word, every gesture, exactly as I had known it would. When Patricia left the kitchen, I stood there staring at the clock on the wall. It read 8:30. I looked at my phone. 8:22. I checked the kitchen clock again. Still 8:30. That was when I realized the clock had been stuck at 8:30 for at least 10 minutes of our conversation. I went to find Mr. Henriksen immediately. He was in his living room watching television, and he seemed surprised by my urgency when I knocked on his door. I told him about the clock in the kitchen, how it seemed to be broken. He assured me he would replace the battery, but did not seem particularly concerned. I wanted to tell him about the other things, the déjà vu and the repeating moments, but I could not find the words to explain it without sounding insane. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in bed replaying the conversation with Patricia, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. But I could not shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with this house. Around 2 a.m, I got up to use the bathroom. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed light coming from under the door of the room across from mine. The room was supposed to be vacant. Mr. Henriksen had mentioned that the previous tenant had moved out a few weeks before I arrived. I stood outside the door, listening. I could hear movement inside, the sound of someone walking around. Then I heard a voice, male, speaking in a low tone as if talking on the phone. I could not make out the words, but the rhythm and cadence were familiar. Too familiar. With a sinking feeling, I realized I was listening to myself. The voice on the other side of that door was having the exact conversation I had had with my mother 3 days earlier when I called to tell her I was settling in well. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. This was impossible. This could not be happening. I returned to my room and locked the door, spending the rest of the night sitting up in bed with the lights on, too frightened to close my eyes. The next morning, I told myself I had been half asleep and imagined the whole thing. But when I left my room and glanced at the door across the hall, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a small whiteboard on the door where tenants could leave notes. On it, in my own handwriting, was a message I did not remember writing. It said, "Do not leave, not yet." I went straight to Mr. Henriksen and told him I needed to speak with him about the house. He invited me into his living room, and I explained everything: the déjà vu, the repeating moments, the clock, the voice in the empty room, the message on the whiteboard. I expected him to think I was crazy, to suggest I see a doctor or take some time off work. Instead, his expression grew grave and sad. "You are not the first," he said quietly. "The previous tenant in your room, he experienced the same things. He lasted about 3 weeks before he could not take it anymore. The one before him made it almost 2 months. I keep hoping that eventually someone will break the cycle, but so far, no one has." "What cycle?" I demanded. "What is happening in this house?" Mr. Henriksen stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling down a leather journal. He handed it to me. "This belonged to the man who lived in your room in 1978. His name was Robert Marsh. Read it." I opened the journal and began to read. The entries started normally enough, documenting Robert's life in Drumheller, his work, his hopes for the future. But about 2 weeks in, the entries changed. He began describing experiences identical to mine: the déjà vu, the repeating moments, the sense that time was looping back on itself. The final entry was dated 6 weeks after he moved in. It simply said, "I cannot leave. Every time I try to drive away, I end up back at the house. It is as if the roads themselves loop back. I'm trapped in a cycle I do not understand. If anyone reads this, do not stay. Leave while you still can." I looked up at Mr. Henriksen and what happened to him. "He disappeared," the old man said. "Left everything behind in his room. His car was still parked outside, but he was gone. They never found him. The police assumed he had left on foot and met with some accident in the Badlands, but they never found a body." "And you kept renting the room?" I could not keep the anger out of my voice. "I have to," Mr. Henriksen said, and for the first time I saw real fear in his eyes. "If the room stays empty, the phenomenon spreads to the rest of the house. Other tenants start experiencing it. I start experiencing it. But if someone is occupying that room, it stays contained to them. I know it is terrible, and I have tried everything to fix it. Priests, mediums, investigators. Nothing works. The house wants someone in that room." I stood up, the journal still clutched in my hands. "I am leaving. Right now." "You can try," Mr. Henriksen said sadly, "but I do not think it will let you go that easily. Not now that it has you in its grip. Robert tried to leave dozens of times according to his journal. He always ended up back here." I did not believe him. I ran upstairs, threw my belongings into my suitcase, and carried everything down to my car. Mr. Henriksen watched from the porch, but did not try to stop me. I drove out of town, heading west toward Calgary. I was going to get as far away from Drumheller as possible and never look back. But something strange happened. The highway seemed longer than it should have been. I drove for what felt like an hour, but the landscape never changed. The same coulees, the same rock formations, the same sparse vegetation. I checked my GPS. It showed I was making progress, that I was getting closer to Calgary. But when I looked out the window, I could swear I was seeing the same landmarks over and over again. Then I crested a hill and saw Drumheller spread out below me. I was back at the east entrance to town, exactly where I had started. I checked my odometer. I'd driven 70 kilometers. I checked my GPS again. It showed I was in Calgary at the address I had been heading for. But my eyes showed me Drumheller. I sat in my car on the side of the road, fighting back panic. I tried again. This time I drove east toward Medicine Hat. Same result. After an hour of driving, I found myself back in Drumheller. I tried south, then north. Every direction led me back to the same place. Mr. Henriksen had been right. I could not leave. I have been in Drumheller for 8 months now. I still go to work. still maintain the appearance of a normal life. But I know the truth. I'm trapped in something I cannot understand or escape. The déjà vu continues. The moments repeat. And sometimes I catch glimpses of the other versions of myself that seem to exist in this house. The me that already lived through this day, or this week, or this month. Time is not linear here. It folds back on itself in ways that make my head hurt to think about. I have stopped trying to leave. The last tenant's journal mentioned that he could not leave, and his last entry said just one more day before he disappeared. I am terrified that if I keep trying to break free, I will end up like him. Gone, erased, lost in whatever temporal loop has claimed this house. So I stay, and I live the same days over and over, and I try not to think about what it means that I can sometimes hear my own voice in the empty room across the hall, living through conversations I have not yet had. If you ever find yourself in Drumheller looking for a place to rent, and an old man named Henriksen offers you a cheap room in his house, do not take it. Walk away. Drive away. Get as far from that place as you can, because once the house has you, once you start experiencing those repeating moments, you will never truly be free. You will be trapped in an endless Tuesday, or Wednesday, or whatever day the house decides to loop for you, and eventually you will disappear like all the others, leaving nothing behind but a journal and a warning that no one will heed. I have always considered myself a practical person. I work as a wildlife biologist. I believe in data and observation, and I have spent countless nights camping alone in remote locations without ever feeling afraid. So when I planned a solo camping trip to the Alberta Badlands near the abandoned settlement of Blériot in June of last year, I expected nothing more than a peaceful weekend of hiking and photography. What I experienced instead has left me with questions I cannot answer and gaps in my memory that terrify me more than any explanation could. Blériot is a ghost town, one of many scattered across the prairies that were abandoned during the Dust Bowl era or shortly after. Only a few crumbling foundations remain, along with the skeletal frames of what were once homes and businesses. The landscape around it is harsh and beautiful, all eroded coulees and exposed layers of sedimentary rock. I had been wanting to explore the area for months, and I finally had a free weekend to make the trip. I arrived on a Friday afternoon in late June. The drive from Edmonton had taken about 3 hours, and I spent the last 30 minutes on increasingly rough dirt roads until I reached the spot I had scouted on satellite imagery. It was a flat area near one of the old building foundations, sheltered from the wind by a low ridge. I set up my tent, organized my gear, and spent the remainder of the daylight exploring the immediate area and taking photographs of the ruins. The sun set around 9:30, and I made myself dinner on my camp stove while watching the sky turn from orange to deep purple. The silence out there was absolute. No highway noise, no aircraft, not even the sound of insects. Just the occasional whisper of wind across the rocks. I felt completely at peace. I went to bed around 11, crawling into my sleeping bag with the satisfaction of a successful first day. That is the last clear memory I have for 8 days. The next thing I remember with any certainty is waking up in my tent with sunlight streaming through the fabric. I felt disoriented and groggy, as if I had overslept by hours. I checked my watch. It was 2 in the afternoon. That seemed odd, but I figured I must have been more exhausted than I realized. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, immediately noticing that something was wrong. My gear was scattered everywhere. My backpack was 20 feet from the tent, its contents strewn across the ground. My camera was sitting on top of one of the old foundations, positioned carefully, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. My camp stove was disassembled, the pieces arranged in a perfect circle around my tent. None of this made sense. I am meticulously organized when I camp. I would never leave my gear like this. I checked my phone, thinking maybe I had gotten drunk the previous night and forgotten, though I had not brought any alcohol with me. The phone was dead despite having been fully charged when I went to bed. I walked back to my truck to get my charging cable and noticed that the driver's side door was hanging open. I never leave doors open when camping in remote areas. It is an invitation for animals to get inside. I plugged my phone into the truck's USB port and waited for it to power on. When it did, I felt my stomach drop. The date showed June 23rd. I had arrived on June 15th. According to my phone, I had been out here for 8 days, but I only remembered one night. One single night. I scrolled through my photos with shaking hands. There were hundreds of images I did not remember taking. Pictures of the ruins from every conceivable angle, close-ups of rocks and plant life, selfies of me smiling at the camera, looking perfectly normal and happy. The timestamps on the photos showed they had been taken over the course of the entire week. Every day, multiple times per day, but I had no memory of taking any of them. Some of the photos were disturbing in ways I could not articulate. There was a series taken at night, the flash illuminating the darkness around my tent. In several of them, my camping gear had been arranged in strange patterns, circles, spirals, lines radiating out from a central point. In one photo, my sleeping bag was spread out on the ground 50 feet from my tent, positioned as if someone had been lying there, staring up at the stars. The final series of photos was the most unsettling. They showed the old foundation of what must have been the largest building in Blériot, probably a general store or community hall. My belongings were arranged in a perfect circle around the foundation. My clothes, my food, my camping equipment, everything I had brought with me. And in the center of the foundation, barely visible in the photo, were marks scratched into the dirt, symbols or letters, I could not tell which. The photo was slightly out of focus, as if my hands had been shaking when I took it. I ran to the foundation. My belongings were still there, arranged exactly as they appeared in the photo. I stood at the edge of the circle, afraid to step inside, trying to understand what had happened to me. The marks in the dirt were still visible, though the wind had already begun to blur them. They looked like writing, but not in any alphabet I recognized. Crude lines and curves that suggested meaning without conveying it. That is when I noticed the marks on my arms. Scratches, dozens of them, running up and down my forearms. They were not deep, more like the kind of scratches you get from walking through brush, but I was wearing long sleeves and I could not remember taking them off all week. I checked the rest of my body. More scratches on my legs, a bruise on my left hip, dirt under my fingernails, evidence of a week of activity that I could not remember. I gathered my belongings with frantic urgency, throwing everything into my truck without bothering to organize or pack properly. I just wanted to leave. I needed to get back to civilization, to talk to someone, to figure out what had happened to me. But when I tried to start the truck, the engine would not turn over. The battery was completely dead, which made no sense because it was less than a year old. I sat in the driver's seat trying not to panic. I had no cell service out here. I was at least an hour's walk from the nearest occupied farmhouse, assuming I could even remember which direction to go. The sun was already past its peak, which meant I had maybe 6 hours of daylight left. I could walk out, or I could wait and hope someone came looking for me. But who would? I had told my coworkers I was taking a weekend camping trip. They would not expect me back until Monday. They probably had not even noticed I was missing yet. I decided to walk. I grabbed my water bottles, my phone, even though it was useless, and a flashlight. I locked the truck and started walking down the dirt road I had driven in on. I'd gone maybe half a mile when I heard an engine. A farm truck appeared over a rise, heading toward me. I waved frantically and the driver, an older man in his 60s, pulled over. "You okay?" he asked, eyeing me with concern. I must have looked terrible. "My truck battery died," I said, which was true but felt like a vast understatement of my situation. "Could I get a ride to town?" He agreed without hesitation, and I climbed into his truck. During the drive, he asked me what I had been doing out here. I told him I was camping near Blériot. His expression changed immediately. "By yourself?" he asked. I nodded. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You're the third person in 2 years to come out of there looking confused and scared. Last one was a couple from Ontario. They said they lost 3 days with no memory of it. Before that, it was a young guy, university student. Same thing, lost time, scattered gear, no explanation." "Did they ever figure out what happened?" I asked. "No," he said. "Doctors could not find anything wrong with them. No drugs in their system, no signs of head trauma. Police investigated but found nothing suspicious. Eventually people stopped talking about it. Small town, you know, folks do not like mysteries that make them uncomfortable." He drove me to the RCMP detachment in Drumheller. I filed a report, though I could tell the officer taking my statement was skeptical. They sent a tow truck for my vehicle and suggested I see a doctor. I drove to the hospital in Calgary that same evening. They ran every test they could think of. Blood work, toxicology, brain scans. Everything came back normal. The doctor said I was in perfect health and suggested the memory loss might be psychological, perhaps a response to stress or isolation. But I know it was not psychological. I know something happened to me in those 8 days, something I cannot remember, but that left physical evidence. The photos on my phone, the scratches on my arms, the symbols drawn in the dirt. Whatever it was real. I've tried to piece together what might have occurred. I've researched missing time experiences, looked into environmental factors that could cause memory loss, even considered the possibility of some kind of fugue state. None of it feels right. The deliberate arrangement of my belongings, the systematic documentation in photographs, the symbols, it all suggests intention and consciousness, but not my own. The worst part is the sense that something was done to me during those lost days, something I participated in but cannot recall. When I look at the selfies on my phone, at my smiling face, I do not recognize the expression. It looks like me, but it does not feel like me. It is as if someone else was inhabiting my body, going through the motions of camping and hiking while I was somewhere else entirely. I have not been camping alone since. I have not returned to the Badlands. I changed my phone number because I kept getting strange calls in the middle of the night where no one spoke, but I could hear wind and the sound of rocks shifting. I moved to a new apartment because I could not shake the feeling that something had followed me home from Blériot, that it was waiting for the right moment to take me back to wherever I was during those 8 missing days. Sometimes late at night, I have flashes of memory that might be dreams or might be something else. I see myself standing in a circle of stones under a sky full of stars. I see shadows moving at the edge of my vision, shapes that do not belong to any animal I know. I hear voices speaking in a language that predates any human tongue. And I feel a terrible certainty that I am supposed to remember something important, something that was shown to me or done to me, but the memory slips away as soon as I reach for it. I still have the photos on my phone. I've looked at them hundreds of times searching for clues. In one of the night photos, if you zoom in on the background, you can see something standing at the edge of the frame. It is too far away and too dark to make out details, but the proportions are wrong. Too tall, too thin, limbs that bend at angles that should not be possible. I showed it to colleagues, and they suggested it was a trick of shadow and light. But I know what I see. Whatever happened to me in Blériot, I was not alone. Something else was there, and it took 8 days of my life, for reasons I will never understand. I can only hope that it is satisfied with what it took, and that it will never come looking for the rest. I am a long-haul trucker, and I have driven through every province in Canada more times than I can count. I have seen stretches of highway so desolate that you can drive for an hour without seeing another vehicle. I have weathered blizzards and ice storms and fog so thick you could barely see 10 feet ahead. Nothing has ever truly frightened me on the road until the night I stopped at the crossroads outside Dorothy, Alberta. Dorothy is barely a town anymore. Maybe 50 people live there, if that. It is one of those places that used to thrive when the railroad came through, but withered away when the trains stopped running. I had driven past it dozens of times over the years, usually in daylight, and never thought much about it. But on this particular night in October of last year, I was running behind schedule and my fuel gauge was dropping faster than I liked. The next town with a proper truck stop was still 2 hours away, and I did not want to risk running on empty in the middle of nowhere. I pulled into the small gas station in Dorothy around 11 at night. The place was ancient, one of those old-fashioned setups with a single pump and a tiny convenience store attached. An old man sat behind the counter, watching a portable television with terrible reception. He looked up when I walked in, and I saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, maybe, or concern. "Evening," I said, heading for the coffee machine in the corner. "Evening," he replied, but his tone was cautious. "You just passing through?" "That is the plan," I said, filling a styrofoam cup with coffee that looked like it had been sitting there since morning. "Need to make Calgary by dawn." The old man nodded slowly. "You take Highway 41 north out of here?" "I was planning to," I said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "There is a crossroads about 10 kilometers north, old intersection, where a side road used to connect to a homestead. The homestead is long gone, but the roads are still there, just dirt tracks now." "Okay," I said, not sure where he was going with this. "Do not stop there," he said, and the seriousness in his voice made me look up from counting out bills for the coffee. "If your truck breaks down, if you get a flat tire, if anything happens at that crossroads, do not stop. Do whatever you can to get past it before you pull over. Trust me on this. I have met my share of superstitious people on the road, folks who believe in bad luck and cursed stretches of highway. I usually just nod politely and move on, but something about the way this old man looked at me made my skin prickle. "What is at the crossroads?" I asked. "Nothing you want to meet," he said. "Nothing anyone wants to meet. People who stop there, sometimes they do not leave the same as they arrived. Sometimes they do not leave at all." I thanked him for the warning, paid for my coffee, and headed back to my truck. I told myself it was just small-town folklore, the kind of story people tell to make their boring lives more interesting. But as I pulled back onto the highway and continued north, I could not shake the uneasiness that had settled over me. The highway was completely empty. No other vehicles in either direction, no lights except my own headlights cutting through the darkness. The landscape out here is flat and featureless, just endless prairie stretching away on both sides. I drove for about 15 minutes before I saw the crossroads ahead. 2 dirt roads intersecting the highway, one on each side, forming a perfect cross. In the middle of the intersection, barely visible in my headlights, was an old wooden post with weathered boards nailed to it. The kind of marker that used to show directions to homesteads or towns that no longer existed. I was going to drive straight through without a second thought. But as I approached the intersection, my truck began to shudder. The engine made a grinding sound I had never heard before, and the steering wheel jerked hard to the right. I fought to keep the truck on the road, but it was pulling toward the crossroads with a force that did not feel mechanical. It felt deliberate. The truck came to a stop directly in the center of the crossroads, the engine dying completely. I sat there in the sudden silence, my heart hammering, remembering the old man's warning. Do not stop at the crossroads. But I had not chosen to stop. The truck had stopped on its own. I tried to restart the engine. The key turned, but nothing happened. Not even the clicking sound you get from a dead battery. Just absolute silence. I checked my phone. No signal, which was not surprising out here. I was completely alone. That is when I noticed the wooden post. It was directly in front of my truck, maybe 10 feet away, and I could see now that the boards nailed to it had writing carved into them. Not painted, carved directly into the wood. The letters were crude and deep, as if someone had spent hours gouging them out with a knife. I could not read what they said from inside the truck. I know what you're thinking. Stay in the truck, lock the doors, and wait for another vehicle to come by. That is exactly what I was thinking too. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt compelled to look at those boards, to read what was carved into them. It was not curiosity. It was something stronger, something that felt like it was coming from outside my own mind, an insistence that I needed to see what was written there. I opened the truck door and stepped down onto the pavement. The night was absolutely still. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing. Just the kind of silence that feels wrong, as if the world is holding its breath. I walked toward the wooden post, my boots echoing on the asphalt. The carvings were names, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, covering every inch of the boards. Some were old and weathered, barely legible. Others looked fresh, the wood still, light where it had been cut. I recognized a few of the names. Missing persons cases I had heard about on the news over the years. A family that vanished while driving through Alberta in the 80s. A trucker who disappeared without a trace 5 years ago. A hitchhiker who was last seen on this highway. My hands started shaking. This was not folklore. This was real. People had stopped at this crossroads and something had happened to them. Something bad enough that their names ended up carved into this post. That is when I heard the voice. It came from behind me, from the direction of the dirt road that led east. A whisper at first, barely audible, speaking words I could not quite make out. Then louder, clearer, forming sounds that might have been a language but did not match anything I had ever heard. It was wrong in the same way the silence was wrong, in the same way the truck stopping here had been wrong. I turned slowly, afraid of what I might see. At first, I saw nothing, just the dirt road disappearing into darkness. Then I noticed movement. Something tall was standing about 50 feet down that road, partially obscured by shadow. As I stared at it, it took a step forward into the faint spill of my truck's parking lights. I cannot adequately describe what I saw. It had the approximate shape of a person, but the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet, with limbs that seemed to have extra joints. Its face was the worst part. Flat and featureless except for a mouth that was too wide, stretched in something that might have been a smile but conveyed no warmth or humor. Just hunger. It spoke again, and this time I understood one word mixed in with the incomprehensible sounds. My name. It said my name in a voice that sounded like wind through a cracked window. I ran back to my truck, threw myself into the driver's seat, and turned the key with shaking hands. The engine roared to life immediately, as if it had never been dead at all. I did not question it. I slammed the truck into gear and floored the accelerator, feeling the tires screech as I left the crossroads behind. I drove for 2 hours straight without stopping, adrenaline flooding my system, checking my mirrors every few seconds to make sure nothing was following me. When I finally pulled into the truck stop outside Calgary, I sat in the parking lot for 30 minutes trying to calm down before I could trust myself to walk inside. I filed a report with the RCMP the next day. I told them about the crossroads, about the wooden post with the names carved into it, about what I had seen. The officer who took my statement was professional but skeptical. He said they would send someone to check it out. I gave them exact coordinates from my GPS, the intersection of Highway 41 and those 2 dirt roads. 2 days later, I got a call. They had found the crossroads. They had found the wooden post, but according to the officer, the post had no carvings on it. Just an old weathered marker with a few rusted nails sticking out. No names. No evidence that anything had ever been written there. I know what I saw. I know what I read on those boards. I know that thing I encountered was real, no matter how impossible it sounds. But I also know that no one will ever believe me, just like they have probably not believed the others who stopped at that crossroads and lived to tell about it. I have changed my routes. I do not drive through Dorothy anymore. I do not care if it adds 3 hours to my trip. I will take the long way around, drive on major highways with plenty of traffic, Stay away from those empty stretches of road where things that should not exist wait in the darkness. And I will never forget the last thing I saw as I drove away from that crossroads. In my rearview mirror, just for a second before it vanished, I saw the thing standing in the middle of the intersection. It was not watching me leave. It was carving something into the wooden post with one of those impossibly long fingers, adding another name to the collection. I pray it was not mine. I have always been drawn to abandoned places. There is something fascinating about walking through spaces that were once filled with life and activity, seeing the layers of history left behind. As an urban explorer and photographer, I have documented dozens of abandoned sites across Western Canada, factories, hospitals, schools, you name it. I have never been afraid of these places. The dead do not scare me. It is the living you have to worry about. That was my philosophy until I explored the old coal mine near Wayne, Alberta. Wayne is a ghost town in the truest sense. It sits in a valley outside Drumheller, accessible by a winding road that crosses the Rosebud River 11 times via a series of old wooden bridges. At its peak in the 1920s, Wayne had a population of over 2,000 people working in the numerous coal mines that honeycombed the surrounding hills. Today, fewer than 30 people live there, and most of the mine entrances have been sealed or collapsed. Most, but not all. I had heard about one particular mine from another explorer I met at a convention in Calgary. He told me it was accessible if you knew where to look, and that the interior was relatively stable. He also mentioned that very few people explored it because the locals strongly discouraged anyone from going near it. That, of course, made me want to see it even more. I convinced my friend Sarah to come with me. She was less experienced than I was, but eager to learn, and I felt better having someone along as a safety precaution. We made the drive out to Wayne on a Saturday in September, arriving around 10 in the morning. The weather was perfect, clear and cool, ideal for spending several hours underground. Finding the mine entrance took longer than I expected. It was not marked on any map, and we had to hike about 2 kilometers up a steep hillside, following vague directions and looking for landmarks. When we finally found it, I understood why it had remained relatively unknown. The entrance was partially hidden by brush and was only about 4 feet high, requiring us to crouch to enter. A rusted chain with a faded warning sign had been strung across the opening at some point, but had long since been broken. We ducked inside, switching on our headlamps and letting our eyes adjust to the darkness. The tunnel was rough-hewn, with wooden support beams that looked frighteningly old and unstable. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, and the air had that distinctive underground smell of damp earth and minerals. We moved slowly, testing each step, documenting everything with our cameras. About 50 meters in, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. This appeared to be a work area, with the remains of old equipment scattered around. Rusted tools, pieces of rail track, a collapsed wheelbarrow. Sarah was excited, taking photos of everything while I examined the walls and ceiling for signs of instability. That was when I noticed the second tunnel branching off from the chamber, heading deeper into the hillside. "Should we check it out?" Sarah asked, following my gaze. I hesitated. Our rule was to never go deeper than we could safely retreat from if something went wrong. But the tunnel looked solid, and I could see that it widened further in. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We followed the second tunnel for what I estimated was another 100 meters, passing through 2 more chambers before we reached a section that made me stop in my tracks. The walls here were different. Instead of rough mining cuts, they had been deliberately smoothed and reinforced with concrete. This was not original mine construction. Someone had done this much more recently. "Abigail," Sarah said quietly, and I heard the tension in her voice. "Look at this." She was standing near a recess in the wall that looked like it had been carved out deliberately. Inside the recess were items that clearly did not belong in an abandoned mine. Blankets, relatively new and folded neatly, plastic bottles of water, non-perishable food in sealed containers, and most disturbing, a collection of women's jewelry spread out on a flat rock like a display. My stomach tightened. Someone was using this mine. Someone was living here, or at least spending significant time here, and based on what I was seeing, they were not here for innocent reasons. "We need to leave," I said. "Right now." Sarah did not argue. We turned to head back the way we came, moving faster now, no longer concerned with documenting our surroundings. We had just reached the first large chamber when we heard it. Footsteps, coming from the direction of the entrance. Someone else was in the mine, and they were between us and the only way out. We switched off our headlamps immediately and pressed ourselves against the wall in the darkness. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure whoever it was would hear it. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, accompanied by a dragging sound, as if the person was pulling something heavy. A flashlight beam swept across the chamber, and I caught a glimpse of a large figure before the light moved on. The person stopped in the center of the chamber. I could hear breathing, heavy and labored, then a voice, male and rough, speaking to himself. "I know someone was here. Fresh footprints in the mud. Came in this morning, looks like." I felt Sarah's hand grip my arm so tightly it hurt. We were trapped. If we tried to run for the entrance, he would catch us in the tunnel. If we stayed where we were, he might search the chamber and find us. Our only option was the deeper tunnel, but that led to a dead end. The man started walking in our direction. His flashlight beam played across the walls, coming closer. I made a split-second decision. I grabbed Sarah's hand, and we moved as quietly as possible toward the second tunnel, the one that led deeper into the mine. Behind us, I heard the man stop. "I can hear you," he said, and his voice was calm, almost amused. "There is no point hiding. This mine has only one entrance. I can wait all day at the exit. Eventually you will have to come out, and I will be there." We kept moving, reaching the concrete reinforced section of tunnel. I desperately scanned the walls with my headlamp, now switched to its dimmest setting, looking for anything that might help us. That is when I saw it. A narrow crack in the wall, partially hidden by shadows. I moved closer and realized it was another passage, probably a ventilation shaft or an escape route. It was tight, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it was something. I pushed Sarah toward it. "Go," I whispered. "I will be right behind you." She hesitated for only a second before she started squeezing through the gap. I glanced back down the tunnel. The man's flashlight was getting closer. I could hear him moving through the concrete section now, could hear him speaking again. "Found your little nest, did you? Saw my collection. Those are souvenirs. Every one of them belonged to someone who came poking around where they should not have." I squeezed into the crack after Sarah, feeling the rough stone scraping against my shoulders and back. The passage was claustrophobic, barely allowing forward movement, but after about 3 meters, it opened into a narrow natural fissure in the rock. I could feel air moving, which meant this led somewhere. Behind us, I heard the man reach the concrete section. "Where did you go?" His voice had lost its calm amusement and now carried frustration and anger. "Get back here. Make this easy on yourselves." We moved through the fissure as fast as we dared, sometimes having to turn sideways to fit through the narrow sections. My jacket caught on a sharp projection and tore, but I did not stop. The fissure began to slope upward, and the air got fresher. Daylight. We were close to the surface. The fissure ended in a jumble of collapsed rock and dead brush. We could see blue sky through gaps in the debris. Sarah and I attacked the obstruction with frantic energy, pulling away branches and loose rocks, widening the opening until we could squeeze through. We emerged on the hillside about 50 meters from where we had entered the mine, our clothes torn and our hands bleeding from the rough stone. We did not stop running until we reached Sarah's car. Only then did I pull out my phone and call the RCMP. We drove to the detachment in Drumheller and gave our statements, describing everything we had seen. The jewelry, the supplies, the man in the mine. They took us seriously. especially when I showed them the photos I had managed to take before we switched off our lights. The RCMP organized a search of the mine that same day. What they found was worse than I had imagined. The concrete section was only the beginning. Deeper in the mine, the man had created a series of rooms, storage areas, living spaces, and worst of all, a room with chains bolted to the wall and evidence that people had been held there. DNA testing later confirmed that at least 3 missing persons from the region had been in that room. The man himself was caught trying to leave Alberta 2 days later. His truck was stopped at a checkpoint, and when police searched it, they found more items that matched the descriptions of belongings from missing women. His name was Gerald Hutchins, and he had worked as a surveyor for coal companies in the area decades earlier. He knew the mine systems better than anyone, and had been using that knowledge to prey on people for years. The trial was long and difficult. Sarah and I both testified about what we found and what happened in that mine. Hutchins was convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping, confinement, and murder. He is serving multiple life sentences with no possibility of parole. But here is what keeps me up at night. During the investigation, police discovered that Hutchins had been using that mine as his base of operations for at least 15 years. 15 years. And in that time, how many people had gone into that mine and never come out? How many disappeared without anyone connecting their disappearance to a sealed mine in a ghost town? The answer is, we will never know for sure. But when they excavated deeper into the mine, in sections that had partially collapsed, they found remains. Not 3 victims. Not 5. More than a dozen sets of remains, some of them too degraded to identify. Each one representing a person who had gone into that mine and encountered Gerald Hutchins. I stopped doing urban exploration after that. I could not shake the feeling that every abandoned place might be hiding something equally terrible, that in seeking out these forgotten spaces, I was walking into traps set by people who knew that curiosity would eventually bring someone to them. Sarah and I do not talk much anymore. The experience bonded us in a way, but it also traumatized us. Every time we see each other, we remember what almost happened in that mine. What would have happened if we had not found that fissure? What would have happened if I had gone alone, as I sometimes did? Sometimes, I think about the jewelry we saw in that recess. Each piece carefully arranged like a shrine or a trophy. During the trial, families identified some of those items. A mother recognized her daughter's necklace. A husband identified his wife's wedding ring. Each one a life stolen. A person who went looking for adventure or solace in an abandoned place and found a monster instead. If you ever find yourself tempted to explore an abandoned mine, especially in a remote area, do not do it. Trust me when I say that some places are abandoned for good reason, and some of those reasons are still waiting in the darkness, patient and hungry, for the next curious person to wander into their trap. Because we were lucky. We found a way out, but more than a dozen others were not so lucky, and their names are carved into my memory just as deeply as Gerald Hutchins carved his evil into that hillside. I am a photographer, and I specialize in architectural documentation. Over the past 5 years, I have photographed hundreds of historic buildings across the prairies, creating a visual archive of structures that are slowly disappearing. It is solitary work, but I find it meditative. There is something profound about capturing these places before they are lost to time and weather. Last April, I drove out to the village of Rowley, Alberta, to photograph what remains of the town. Rowley is one of Alberta's most well-preserved ghost towns, with 3 wooden grain elevators still standing and several historic buildings scattered along the main street. The population hovers around 10 people, mostly retirees, who have chosen to live out their days in this quiet place. I had been wanting to photograph Rowley for months, and I finally had a weekend free to make the trip. I arrived on a Saturday afternoon under perfect conditions. Clear skies, good light, minimal wind. I spent several hours walking through the town, setting up my tripod, composing shots of the grain elevators against the prairie sky. The silence was remarkable. No traffic, no machinery, just the occasional creak of old wood settling and the distant call of birds. Around 4 in the afternoon, I decided to photograph the old hotel. It is a 2-story building that has been abandoned for decades, its windows dark and empty, its paint long since peeled away. I had researched the building before coming and knew it dated back to 1922. I wanted to capture it from several angles, including some interior shots if the building was accessible. The front door was unlocked, which was not unusual for buildings in ghost towns. I pushed it open carefully and stepped inside. The interior was exactly what I expected. Dust, debris, remnants of furniture too damaged to salvage. I took my time composing shots of the lobby, the old registration desk, the staircase leading to the second floor. Everything was documented methodically, as I always do. I spent about 20 minutes inside the hotel before the light began to change, and I decided to move on to other locations. I returned to my car, downloaded my photos onto my laptop to check the exposures, and continued photographing the grain elevators until the sun started setting. By 7 in the evening, I was satisfied with what I had captured and began the drive back to Edmonton. It was not until that night, when I was reviewing the photos in detail on my desktop computer, that I noticed something impossible. In several of the shots I had taken inside the hotel, there were figures in the windows, human shapes, clearly visible, standing in the second-floor windows looking down at where I had been standing in the street below. At first, I thought it must be reflections or artifacts from dust on my lens, but as I examined the images more carefully, I realized these were not reflections. These were people, or rather the shapes of people. They appeared in multiple shots from different angles, always in the windows, always watching. In one particularly clear image, I could make out details. A woman in what looked like a long dress from the 1920s. A man in a suit and hat, both of them staring directly at the camera. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I'd been inside that hotel. I'd walked through every room on the ground floor. The staircase to the second floor was partially collapsed, and I had not attempted to go up. But more importantly, the building was empty. I would have heard anyone moving around up there. The floorboards creaked with every step. It would have been impossible for people to be on the second floor without me knowing. I pulled up the images I had taken from inside the hotel, the shots of the staircase and the lobby. And there, in the background of one of the interior shots, partially visible through a doorway, was the same woman. She was standing in what I assumed was a side room facing away from the camera, her dress and posture suggesting she was from another era entirely. I had not seen her when I was there. I had not seen anyone. The building had been silent and empty, but my camera had captured something I had missed, something that should not have been there. I spent the next hour going through every photo from Rowley, examining each one in detail. The figures appeared in 6 different images, always in the hotel, always on the second floor, or in rooms I had not entered. Never close enough to make out facial features clearly, but close enough to know they were there. And in every single image, they were looking at me, at the camera, at the exact spot where I had been standing. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe the building was not as empty as I thought. Maybe someone lived there, some squatter I had not noticed. But that did not explain the clothing, the old-fashioned style that matched the era of the building. And it did not explain how they could be on a second floor with a collapsed staircase. The next morning, I called the Rowley Community Association. A woman named Margaret answered, and I explained who I was and that I had been photographing the town. I asked her if anyone lived in the old hotel or if it was used for anything. "No one has been in that building in years," she said. "The stairs are not safe. We keep meaning to board it up, but we never seem to get around to it." "Did you go inside?" "Just the ground floor," I said. I took some photos, but when I reviewed them later, there were people in the windows, in the second floor windows. I was wondering if you knew who they might be. There was a long pause on the line. When Margaret spoke again, her tone had changed. "You saw them too." "Too?" I asked. "You're not the first person to photograph that building and see things that were not there when you took the picture," she said. "It has been happening for years. People take photos, then later they see figures in the windows or standing in doorways, always dressed in old clothing, always on the second floor." "Has anyone ever gone up there to investigate?" I asked. "A few people have tried," Margaret said. "The stairs are dangerous, but some folks have managed to get up there. They never find anything. Empty rooms, old furniture, nothing unusual. But the photos keep showing the same things. We have a whole collection of them at the community hall. Different photographers, different cameras, different years, but always the same figures." She asked if I would be willing to share my photos with them to add to their collection. I agreed and sent them over. A few days later, Margaret called me back. "I showed your photos to Clara, one of our oldest residents," she said. "She recognized the people in your pictures. The woman in the dress and the man in the suit. They matched the descriptions of the original hotel owners, William and Elizabeth Thompson. They ran the hotel from 1922 until 1947. Both of them died in the building. William from a heart attack, Elizabeth from pneumonia. They are buried in the Rowley Cemetery." I asked if anyone had ever explained why they appeared in photos, but not in person. "There are theories," Margaret said. "Some people think it is a residual haunting, like an imprint left on the building. Others think the camera picks up something the human eye cannot see, but honestly, no one knows. All we know is that it keeps happening. The Thompsons are still in their hotel, and they do not seem interested in leaving." After that conversation, I could not stop thinking about the photos. I had hundreds of hours of experience photographing old buildings, and I had never encountered anything like this. I had always been skeptical of ghost stories and paranormal claims, but I could not explain what my camera had recorded. I could not dismiss it as a trick of light or a technical error. The figures were too clear, too consistent across multiple images. I decided to return to Rowley. I needed to see that hotel again, to try to understand what I had photographed. I made the drive on a Wednesday morning, arriving at the town around 10. The hotel looked exactly as it had the previous week. Empty, abandoned, silent. I stood across the street and looked up at the second floor windows. Nothing. Just dark glass and empty frames. I raised my camera and took a photo. Then another. Then a dozen more, from different angles and distances. I did not see anything unusual through the viewfinder, but I had learned that did not mean anything. I downloaded the photos onto my laptop right there in the street, and there they were again. William and Elizabeth Thompson standing in the windows of their hotel, looking down at me. In one of the new photos, Elizabeth was holding what looked like a lantern, though the image was slightly transparent, like a double exposure. In another, William was standing in the doorway I had walked through the previous week, his hand raised as if in greeting or warning. I've thought about this a great deal over the past few months. I have researched residual hauntings, studied the history of the Thompsons and their hotel, talked to experts in paranormal photography. No one can give me a definitive answer about what is happening in that building. What I do know is this. Photography is supposed to capture reality, to freeze a moment in time exactly as it exists. But my photos of the Rowley Hotel captured something that was not visible when I was there, something that exists in a different layer of time or reality. William and Elizabeth Thompson are still in that hotel, still going about whatever routine they followed in life, and somehow my camera is able to record their presence even when my eyes cannot see them. I have the photos framed in my office now, not because I am proud of them, but because they remind me that there are things in this world that cannot be explained by science or logic, that old buildings hold more than just memories and history. Some of them hold the people who live there, trapped or choosing to remain visible only through the lens of a camera. I still photograph abandoned buildings, It is still my passion and my profession, but I am more careful now about what I might be capturing. I review every photo immediately, checking for things that should not be there. And when I find them, as I sometimes do, I add them to a private collection that no one else sees. Evidence of a world that exists alongside our own, invisible to the naked eye but undeniably real. If you ever visit Rowley and photograph the old hotel, check your images carefully when you get home. You might see William and Elizabeth Thompson looking back at you from their windows, still watching over the building they devoted their lives to, still present in a town that the living have mostly abandoned. And if you do see them, remember that you are looking at something impossible made real, at proof that death is not always the end, and that some places hold their history so tightly that the past and present exist simultaneously, separated only by the thin barrier of perception that a camera lens can sometimes penetrate. I took the security job out of desperation more than anything else. After losing my position as a retail manager when the store closed, I needed income, and I needed it fast. The job posting was straightforward. Overnight security guard at a decommissioned grain elevator outside the village of Champion, Alberta. 12-hour shifts, 4 nights a week, minimal supervision. The pay was decent, and the company explained they needed someone on site to deter vandals and metal scavengers who had been stripping copper and equipment from abandoned agricultural sites across the region. Champion is a small place, population less than 400, located about an hour southeast of Calgary. The grain elevator sat on the outskirts, a massive wooden structure that had been built in 1928 and shut down in 2003 when the last grain line closed. It loomed over the empty prairie like a monument to a different era, its weathered wood and faded paint, testament to decades of wind and weather. My first shift was a Tuesday in late January. I arrived at 6 in the evening, just as the sun was setting. The site supervisor, an older man named Gerald, showed me around. The elevator had 5 main levels connected by a network of metal stairs and catwalks. The ground floor held the old office, which had been converted into a security station with a desk, a chair, a space heater, and a bank of monitors connected to cameras placed throughout the structure. The upper levels were storage bins and machinery rooms, all empty now, just vast spaces filled with shadows and the lingering smell of grain dust. The cameras cover most of the important areas, Gerald explained, pointing to the monitors. But you should do physical rounds every couple of hours. Walk the building, check the doors, make sure no one has broken in. We have had problems with thieves cutting through fences and stripping wire. Your main job is to be a visible presence and call the RCMP if you see anyone suspicious. He showed me the stairwell that accessed all 5 levels, demonstrated the radio I should use to contact the security company if needed, and then left me alone. The sun finished setting, darkness fell, and I was by myself in a 90-year-old grain elevator in the middle of nowhere. The first few hours were uneventful. I sat in the office, drank coffee from my thermos, and watched the monitors. The cameras showed empty rooms, dark corridors, metal staircases disappearing into shadow. Nothing moved. Nothing made sound except the wind rattling against the exterior walls. At 10 o'clock, I decided to do my first round. I took my flashlight and walked out of the office, heading for the main stairwell. The elevator was significantly colder outside the small heated space, and my breath formed clouds in the beam of my light. I climbed to the second level, walked through the storage areas, checked the windows and doors. Everything was secure, and I continued to the third level, then the fourth, methodically checking each space. It was on the 5th level, the highest point in the structure, that I noticed something odd. The cameras had shown this level as empty, but standing there in person, I could smell something. Cigarette smoke, fresh cigarette smoke, as if someone had been up here recently. I swept my flashlight around the space, looking for any sign of an intruder. Nothing. Just empty floor space, old machinery, and the metal framework of the ceiling above. But the smell was unmistakable. I radioed the security company and reported it. They logged my call but did not seem particularly concerned. Probably residual smell from years of workers smoking up there, the dispatcher said. Those old buildings hold odors forever, but keep an eye out and call back if you see anyone. I returned to the office, telling myself the dispatcher was probably right, but I kept checking the monitor for the 5th level, watching for any movement. Nothing. At midnight, I decided to do another round. This time, as I climbed the stairs, I heard something. Footsteps. Metal ringing against metal, the sound of someone walking on the catwalks above me. I stopped, my heart rate increasing, and called out, "This is security. The building is closed. Whoever is up there needs to come down immediately." The footsteps stopped. Silence. I waited, listening intently. Then they started again, this time moving in the opposite direction, heading toward the far end of the building. I climbed the stairs as quickly as I dared, reaching the 3rd level and then the 4th, trying to track where the sound was coming from. But by the time I reached the 5th level, the footsteps had stopped completely. The space was empty. I searched every corner, every shadow, shining my flashlight into every possible hiding spot. No one was there. I radioed the company again. They advised me to check the exterior fences for breaches and to call the RCMP if I felt threatened. I went back down to ground level and did a perimeter check. All the fences were intact. All the doors were locked from the inside. No one had entered or exited the building since I arrived. Back in the office, I reviewed the camera footage from the past hour. I watched myself climbing the stairs, watched the empty rooms as I walked through them. But on the camera for the 5th level, right around the time I heard the footsteps, I saw something that made my blood go cold. A shadow moved across the frame. Not a trick of light, but a distinct shape, human-sized, walking across the empty floor space. It was there for maybe 3 seconds before it moved out of camera range. I sat staring at that monitor, willing myself to see the figure again to prove I was not imagining things. At 2:45 in the morning, I got my wish. The 5th level camera showed movement again. This time the figure walked directly through the center of the frame. It was a person, or the shape of a person, wearing what looked like work clothes. The image was grainy and dark, but I could make out enough detail to know it was not a shadow or a trick of the camera. Someone or something was on the 5th level. I grabbed my flashlight and my radio and climbed the stairs for the 3rd time that night. My fear had been replaced by a strange determination. I needed to know what was happening. I needed to confront whatever this was. I reached the 5th level and swept my light across the space. Empty. But this time, I noticed something I had missed before. In the corner of the room, scratched into the old wooden wall, were words, names and dates. Workers who had carved their initials and the years they had worked here. I walked closer, reading them. John M. 1932, Robert L. 1945, Thomas K. 1958, dozens of names spanning decades. And at the very bottom, carved more recently but still weathered with age, was a name that made me pause. James Whitaker, 1974-1994. Unlike the others, this one had 2 dates, the year he started working and the year he stopped. In the same year, I pulled out my phone and searched the name. What I found explained everything and made everything worse. James Whitaker had been a 23-year-old worker at the Champion Grain Elevator. In August of 1974, he had fallen from the 5th level while performing maintenance on the conveyor system. The fall had killed him instantly. The accident report noted that he had been working alone, which was against safety protocols. His body had been found at the bottom of the elevator shaft at 2:47 in the morning by the night watchman who heard the fall. 2:47. I looked at my watch. It was 2:51. I had seen the figure on the camera at 2:45, the same time, give or take, that James Whitaker had fallen to his death 50 years ago. I did not run. I should have, but I did not. Instead, I stood there, in that cold, empty space, and spoke out loud. James Whitaker, I know what happened to you. I know you fell from here. I'm sorry, but I am just doing my job. I'm not here to hurt this place or disrespect your memory. I am just here to keep it safe." The wind rattled the walls. The building creaked and settled. Nothing else happened. I walked back down to the office, reviewed the camera footage again, and saw nothing more that night. At 6 in the morning, Gerald arrived to relieve me. I told him everything about the footsteps, the camera footage, the name carved into the wall, the story of James Whitaker. Gerald listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You are not the first guard to experience this," he said. "We have had 4 people work this position in the past year. 3 of them quit after a few shifts because of what they saw or heard. I did not mention it when you started because I needed someone who would stay, and I hoped maybe you would not encounter anything. Why did you not tell me?" I asked, anger mixing with my exhaustion. "Would you have taken the job if I had?" he asked. He had a point. I probably would not have, but now that I knew, now that I had experienced it myself, I had to decide whether to stay or walk away like the others. I stayed. I worked that position for 4 months, and I encountered James Whitaker regularly. Not every shift, but often enough that I came to expect it. The footsteps on the 5th level, the shadow on the cameras, the smell of cigarette smoke. Always around 2:45 in the morning, always in the same location. I came to think of him not as a ghost or a threat, but as a colleague. Another worker doing his eternal shift in the building he died in. I would acknowledge him when I heard the footsteps, would say goodnight when I finished my rounds. And in some strange way, I felt like he was watching over the building just as I was. The vandalism and theft that had plagued the site before I started my job stopped completely during my time there. Whether that was coincidence or James Whitaker's doing, I will never know. I quit the job in May when I found better employment closer to home. On my last shift, I climbed to the 5th level one final time. I stood in the spot where James had fallen and spoke to him directly. "I'm leaving now. Someone else will be here to watch the building. But I wanted to thank you for keeping me company these past months. I hope you find peace." The wind picked up outside, rattling the walls in a way that almost sounded like a response. I walked down those stairs for the last time, signed out with Gerald, and drove away from the Champion grain elevator as the sun rose over the prairie. I drive past Champion sometimes when I'm heading to visit family in Lethbridge. I always glance at the grain elevator, still standing against the sky, still waiting for whatever comes next. And I wonder if James Whitaker is still there, still walking his eternal rounds at 2:47 in the morning, still carving his presence into the history of that place. I hope he is, because in a world where old buildings are torn down and history's forgotten, there's something almost comforting about knowing that some things remain, that some people refuse to be erased, and that the night shift never truly ends for those who gave their lives to the job. I work as a paramedic in southern Alberta, and I have seen my share of accidents and emergencies on rural highways. Winter driving conditions out here can be brutal, with sudden whiteouts and black ice appearing without warning. But what happened on Highway 2 between Fort Macleod and Claresholm last February was different from anything I had encountered in my 15 years on the job. It was a Sunday afternoon, around 3 o'clock. I was off duty, driving back to Lethbridge after visiting my parents in Calgary. The weather had been clear when I left, but as I drove south, a winter storm rolled in with shocking speed. Within 20 minutes, visibility dropped to almost nothing. Snow was falling so heavily that my windshield wipers could barely keep up, and the highway became a white tunnel with no clear distinction between road and ditch. I slowed to about 40 kilometers per hour, my hands tight on the wheel, debating whether to pull over and wait out the storm. That is when I saw the vehicle in the ditch. It was a white sedan, barely visible against the snow, buried up to its windows in a drift on the east side of the highway. I could see that it was relatively fresh. The snow had not completely covered it yet, which meant it had gone off the road within the past hour or two. I pulled over as safely as I could, activated my hazard lights, and grabbed my medical kit from the back seat. Even off duty, I'm still a paramedic. If someone was injured in that vehicle, I needed to help. I fought through the knee-deep snow to reach the car, already pulling out my phone to call for emergency services. But as I got closer, I realized my phone had no signal. Not unusual in this area during a storm. The driver's side window was partially broken, and I could see blood on the snow near the vehicle. A lot of blood. Fresh blood, bright red against the white, forming a trail that led away from the car toward a fence line about 30 meters away. My training kicked in immediately. Someone was hurt and had left the vehicle, probably disoriented from the crash. I needed to find them before hypothermia set in. I checked inside the vehicle first. The driver's seat was empty, but there was more blood on the steering wheel and dashboard. The airbag had deployed. I could see a purse on the passenger seat and used my gloved hand to carefully open it, looking for identification. The driver's license showed a woman named Rebecca Sawchuk, age 37, address in Calgary. I committed the name to memory and closed the vehicle. The blood trail was already being covered by fresh snow, but I could still make it out. I followed it toward the fence line, calling out as I went. "Rebecca, my name is Andrew. I'm a paramedic. If you can hear me, call out." No response. Just the howl of wind and the hiss of falling snow. I reached the fence and saw where she had crawled under it, leaving more blood on the barbed wire. The trail continued into a field, toward a cluster of trees in the distance. I hesitated. Going into that field in these conditions was dangerous. I could easily become lost or disoriented myself, but I could not leave someone out there to freeze to death. I ducked under the fence, tearing my jacket in the process, and continued following the trail. The blood was getting harder to see as the snow covered it, but I could make out disturbed snow where someone had been walking or crawling. After about 50 meters, I found her jacket. It was lying in the snow, blood-soaked, as if she had taken it off. That was a bad sign. Hypothermia victims often experience paradoxical undressing, where they feel hot even though they are freezing and start removing their clothes. I picked up the jacket and pressed on, moving faster now. The trees were closer, maybe another 100 meters. If she had made it that far, she might have found some shelter from the wind. I was so focused on following the trail that I almost did not notice the cabin until I was 20 feet from it. It was a small structure, barely more than a shack, tucked among the trees. Old and weathered, probably an abandoned line shack from decades ago when this area had active ranches. A faint light flickered in one of the windows. Someone was inside. I ran to the door and pounded on it. "Rebecca, are you in there? I'm here to help." The door opened immediately, and I stumbled inside, out of the wind and snow. The interior was dimly lit by a kerosene lantern, sitting on a rough wooden table. And there, sitting on an old cot against the wall, was Rebecca Sawchuk. She was alive, conscious, and holding a blood-soaked cloth to a gash on her forehead. "Thank God," I said, moving toward her. "I am Andrew. I am a paramedic. I saw your car in the ditch and followed your trail here. Are you hurt anywhere besides your head?" She looked at me with wide, frightened eyes. "How did you find me?" "I followed your blood trail from the car," I said, kneeling beside her to examine her head wound. It was deep and still bleeding, but not arterial. Survivable if we could get her to a hospital. "We need to get you medical attention. Can you walk?" "You should not be here," she whispered. "He will come back." I stopped examining her wound and looked at her face. "Who will come back?" She glanced toward the door, then back at me. "The man who lives here. He found me after I crashed. He brought me here, gave me this lantern, this blanket. But then he left, and he said if I tried to leave, I would die in the storm. He said he would be back soon." Every instinct I had started screaming. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. No one lived out here. This cabin was abandoned, I was sure of it. And if someone had found Rebecca and brought her here, Why would they leave her alone with a head injury? "We need to leave," I said. "Right now." "I do not think I can walk that far," she said. "I feel so weak." I checked her pupils with my phone flashlight. They were responsive, but she was clearly in shock and had lost blood. I estimated she weighed maybe 50 kilograms. I could carry her if necessary. That is when I heard the footsteps outside. Heavy boots crunching in the snow, approaching the cabin. Rebecca gripped my arm, her eyes wide with terror. "That is him." The door opened, and a man stepped inside. He was large, probably 6'4", wearing a heavy winter coat and boots. His face was weathered and hard, and his eyes moved from Rebecca to me with an expression I could not read. Surprise, maybe, or annoyance. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice rough. "I am a paramedic," I said, standing up and positioning myself between him and Rebecca. "I found this woman's vehicle in the ditch and followed her here. She needs medical attention. I am taking her to a hospital." The man closed the door behind him and leaned against it. "Storm is too bad. You will never make it back to the highway. She's safer here until it passes. She has a head injury and possible internal bleeding," I said. "She needs a hospital now. If you want to help, you can drive us there. Do you have a vehicle?" He smiled, and it was not a friendly expression. "My truck is parked about 1 kilometer from here, but I'm not going anywhere in this weather, and neither are you. I've been in dangerous situations before. I've dealt with violent patients, aggressive family members, people high on drugs who saw me as a threat. But this felt different. This man was not agitated or confused. He was calm and in control, and that made him far more dangerous. "I'm going to call for help," I said, pulling out my phone. "No signal out here," he said. "Never is. That is why I like it." I tried anyway. He was right. No bars, no service. I was completely cut off. I looked around the cabin for anything I could use as a weapon. There was the kerosene lantern, a metal poker near a small wood stove, and my medical kit. Not much, but something. "Rebecca," I said quietly, "can you stand?" She nodded and slowly got to her feet, using the wall for support. The man watched us with that same calm expression. "You are making a mistake," he said. "You go out in that storm, you will both die. Stay here, wait it out, everyone lives. Simple." "And what happens if we stay?" I asked. He did not answer, just smiled again. That was all the confirmation I needed. I grabbed the metal poker from beside the stove and pointed it at him. "Move away from the door." He laughed. "Or what? You're going to hit me with that? I have been hit with worse." I did not waste time arguing. I threw the poker at his head as hard as I could, and while he raised his hands to deflect it, I grabbed Rebecca and rushed the door. He was bigger and stronger, but I had the element of surprise. We crashed into him together, and the force knocked him off balance just enough for me to get the door open. We stumbled out into the storm, Rebecca leaning heavily on me. I could hear the man cursing behind us, could hear him getting to his feet. We ran into the trees, moving as fast as Rebecca could manage. The snow was blinding, and I had no idea which direction the highway was. I just knew we had to put distance between us and that cabin. We had gone maybe 50 meters when I heard an engine, not behind us, but off to our left. Headlights appeared through the snow, and for a terrifying moment, I thought it was the man's truck. But then I saw the light bar on top. RCMP. I waved my arms frantically, and the vehicle stopped. An officer jumped out, and I have never been so happy to see anyone in my life. "We need help," I shouted. "There is a man back there. He was holding this woman in a cabin. She has a head injury." The officer radioed for backup and an ambulance, then helped me get Rebecca into the warm patrol car. I told him everything. The crash, the blood trail, the cabin, the man. He took notes, called in the location, and within 20 minutes there were 3 more RCMP vehicles and an ambulance on scene. They found the cabin. They found evidence inside. Rope, duct tape, items that had belonged to other women. items from missing persons cases that went back years. But they did not find the man. His tracks led away from the cabin in the opposite direction, toward where he said his truck was parked. By the time they could organize a proper search, the storm had covered everything. Rebecca recovered from her injuries. The head wound required stitches, and she had a concussion, but she survived. The investigation into the man and that cabin is still ongoing. They identified him from some personal items left behind. His name was Darren Keller, and he had been a suspect in at least 2 disappearances in the area. They are still searching for him, but so far he has not been found. I think about that day often, about how close we came to not making it out of that cabin, about what would have happened if the RCMP had not been doing a patrol on that highway during the storm, about the other women whose belongings were found in that cabin and what became of them, and I think about the blood trail I followed. Later, the RCMP measured it. From Rebecca's car to the cabin was just under 400 meters. She had walked that distance with a severe head injury, in a blizzard, and somehow found the one structure in that entire field. The odds of that are astronomical. Part of me wonders if she was meant to find it, if Darren Keller had somehow orchestrated it, but that does not make sense either. What I do know is that I saved someone that day, but I also learned that monsters do not just exist in abandoned mines and ghost towns. They exist in isolated cabins, in remote corners of the prairies, in places where screams cannot be heard and blood disappears under fresh snow. And sometimes, the only thing standing between a victim and a predator is random chance and a paramedic who happened to be driving by at the right time. Darren Keller, wherever you are, I hope they find you. I hope you pay for what you did to those women. And I hope you remembered the 2 who got away, the ones who refused to be just another set of belongings in your cabin, another name on a list of the disappeared, because we survived you, and your story does not end the way you planned it. I am a home healthcare nurse, and I have been making house calls to elderly and homebound patients across rural Alberta for the past 12 years. The work is rewarding but isolating. You spend hours driving between appointments, visiting people who live in remote farmhouses and small towns where neighbors can be kilometers apart. You see things that stay with you: the loneliness of aging, the stubborn independence of farmers who refuse to leave land their families have worked for generations, the quiet desperation of people who are slowly being forgotten by a world that has moved on without them. Last November, I was assigned a new patient. Her name was Dorothy Kemper, an 86-year-old woman who lived alone on a farm outside the hamlet of Schuler in southeastern Alberta. Schuler is barely a community anymore, just a handful of buildings and maybe 20 residents. Dorothy's farm was another 8 kilometers beyond that, at the end of a gravel road that wound through empty fields and past abandoned homesteads. The referral notes said Dorothy needed help managing her medications and monitoring her blood pressure. She had refused to move to a care facility despite her daughter's pleading, insisting she would die on her own land. My job was to visit her twice a week, make sure she was taking her pills, check her vitals, and report any concerns to her doctor. I made my first visit on a Thursday afternoon. The farm was exactly what I expected. An old 2-story farmhouse with peeling paint and a sagging porch. A collapsed barn behind it, leaning at an angle that defied physics. Fields that had not been cultivated in years, now just prairie grass and weeds. I parked my car near the house and walked to the front door, medical bag in hand. Dorothy answered on the third knock. She was small and frail, with white hair pulled back in a bun and sharp blue eyes that studied me with obvious suspicion. "You're the nurse." "Yes, ma'am. Natalie. I'm here to check on you and make sure your medications are working properly." She stepped aside to let me enter. The interior of the house was cluttered but clean, filled with decades of accumulated possessions. Photographs covered every wall, showing Dorothy and her late husband at various stages of their lives. Working the farm, raising children, celebrating anniversaries. A life lived in this one place, recorded in fading pictures. I went through the standard routine, checked her blood pressure, which was slightly elevated, asked about her diet, her sleep, any pain or discomfort. She answered my questions with the minimum necessary words, clearly not interested in small talk. But when I was packing up my bag to leave, she said something that made me pause. "Do not come here after dark." I looked up. "Excuse me?" "My appointments are always in the afternoon," she said. "The agency knows this. I do not accept visitors after dark, not anymore." "Is there a reason for that?" I asked, keeping my tone professional. She studied me for a long moment, as if deciding whether to answer. Finally, she said, "My son lives in the basement. He does not like visitors." I checked her file later in my car. Dorothy and her husband had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. The son, David, had died in a car accident in 1997. He was 32 years old. I assumed Dorothy was experiencing some confusion or early dementia, talking about her deceased son as if he were still alive. It happened sometimes with elderly patients, especially those living alone. My second visit was the following Tuesday, again in the afternoon. Dorothy seemed slightly more comfortable with me this time, answered my questions more freely, even offered me tea, which I politely declined. But as I was leaving, I heard something from deeper in the house, a sound like footsteps on stairs, heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from below. "That is David," Dorothy said calmly, noticing my reaction. "He is awake." "Mrs. Kemper," I said gently, "according to your records, David passed away many years ago. Is there someone else living here with you?" She laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "You think I'm crazy. Confused old woman who does not know her son is dead. I know he is dead, but he is still here. He has been here since 1999, since I buried him and came back to this house and heard him walking around downstairs. He never left." A chill ran down my spine. I had dealt with grief and delusion before, but something about the way Dorothy spoke suggested she believed every word. And those footsteps had sounded very real. "Has your doctor discussed this with you?" I asked. "Have you mentioned David to anyone?" "I mentioned it once to my daughter," Dorothy said. "She tried to have me committed. Said I was having a mental breakdown, so I stopped talking about it. But David knows you are here. He has been listening to us. He does not like strangers in his mother's house." I left quickly after that, my hands shaking as I drove away. When I got back to the office, I reported the incident to my supervisor. I suggested Dorothy might need a psychiatric evaluation, that she was showing signs of delusion and might not be safe living alone. But my supervisor was reluctant to push it. Dorothy's daughters had been trying for years to move her into care, and Dorothy had lawyers and paperwork establishing her mental competency. Unless she was an immediate danger to herself or others, we could not force her to leave her home. So I continued my visits, and the more I visited, the more I realized Dorothy was not confused. There was something in that house. I heard the footsteps every time I was there, always coming from the basement, always heavy and deliberate, pacing back and forth as if whoever or whatever it was could not rest. Dorothy would pause mid-sentence when the footsteps started, would glance toward the basement door, and then continue as if nothing unusual had happened. The basement door was in the kitchen, always closed, with a simple hook-and-eye latch on the outside. On my 4th visit, I noticed scratches on the inside of the door, visible through the gap at the bottom, deep gouges in the wood, as if something had been clawing at it from the other side. "Why do you keep the door latched?" I asked Dorothy. "To keep him downstairs," she said simply. "During the day, he stays down there. He does not like the light, but at night, if the door is not latched, he comes up. He walks through the house. Sometimes he stands at the foot of my bed and watches me sleep, so I keep the door latched, and I do not come downstairs after dark. We have an understanding." "An understanding," I repeated, not sure what else to say. "He is my son," Dorothy said. "Whatever he has become, he is still my son, and this is his home as much as it is mine. so we share it. I live up here. He lives down there. It works. That night, I could not stop thinking about Dorothy and her son. I researched the car accident that killed David Kemper. It happened on Highway 41, not far from the farm. He had been driving home late at night, hit a patch of black ice, and crashed into a culvert. He died instantly. The article mentioned that he had been living with his mother at the time, helping her manage the farm after his father's death the previous year. I also found his obituary. The photo showed a young man with dark hair and his mother's sharp blue eyes. The funeral had been at a church in Medicine Hat, burial at the family plot near the farm. Nothing unusual. Nothing that explained what Dorothy claimed was happening in her house. My next visit was on a Thursday, my usual day, but I arrived later than normal, around 5 in the evening. The sun was already setting, shadows stretching across the fields. Dorothy opened the door, but did not invite me in immediately. "You're late," she said. "I apologize. My previous appointment ran over. I will make this quick." She hesitated, then stepped aside. "Be quick, and do not go near the basement door." I did my usual checks. Blood pressure was good. Medications were being taken as prescribed. But the whole time I was there, I could feel something wrong. The house was colder than usual. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and the footsteps from the basement were louder, more aggressive. Not pacing now, but moving purposefully, as if whoever was down there knew I was in the house and did not approve. I finished as quickly as I could and was packing up my bag when the basement door rattled. The latch held, but something was pushing against it from the other side. Pushing hard, making the wood creak and the hinges strain. "You need to leave," Dorothy said quietly. "Now." I did not argue. I grabbed my bag and headed for the front door. Behind me, I heard the basement door rattle again, heard something that might have been a voice, low and angry, shouting words I could not understand. I ran to my car, threw my bag in the passenger seat, and drove away without looking back. When I reached the main highway, I pulled over and tried to calm my shaking hands. What I had heard in that house was not imagination. It was not an old woman's delusion. Something was in that basement, something that did not want me there. I reported it to my supervisor the next morning. I told her everything. The footsteps, the scratches on the door, the rattling, the voice. I said I could not return to that house, that Dorothy needed help beyond what I could provide. My supervisor was sympathetic but firm. Without evidence of immediate danger, we could not remove Dorothy from her home, and I was the only nurse willing to make the drive to that remote location. If I refused to go, Dorothy would have no healthcare support at all. So I made a decision. I called Dorothy directly and told her I would continue her care, but only if we changed the appointment time to mid-afternoon, with at least 3 hours of daylight remaining, and I would not enter the house if I heard anything from the basement. If her son was awake, I would reschedule. Dorothy agreed without argument. She understood. I continued seeing Dorothy for 3 more months. We never spoke about David again, but I heard him every time I visited. The footsteps, always downstairs, always pacing. And Dorothy continued living in that house, sharing it with whatever her son had become, maintaining their strange arrangement. In February, I got a call from Dorothy's daughter. Dorothy had passed away in her sleep. Natural causes, her heart had simply stopped. She died in her own bed, in her own home, exactly as she wanted. The daughter asked if I would attend the funeral, and I agreed. At the service, I spoke briefly with Dorothy's other daughter. I asked what would happen to the farmhouse. She said they were selling it, that a developer had bought most of the land in that area and planned to clear the old buildings. The house would be demolished within the month. I could not help asking, "What about the basement? Did anyone go down there when they were clearing out Dorothy's belongings?" The daughter looked uncomfortable. "We tried, but the door would not open. The latch was gone, removed years ago according to Mom's lawyer. But the door was stuck like it was blocked from the inside. We had to call a contractor to break it down. When they finally got it open," she trailed off. "What did they find?" I asked. "Nothing," she said. completely empty. Just a concrete floor and stone walls, but the contractor refused to go down there, said it felt wrong, said the temperature dropped 20 degrees as soon as the door opened. He finished the job but charged us extra for hazard pay. The house was demolished in March. I drove past the property once a few weeks after. The farmhouse was gone, just a cleared foundation and empty land. And I hope, though I cannot know for sure, that whatever was in that basement is finally at rest. Dorothy Kemper spent her last years sharing her home with her dead son, maintaining a fragile peace with something that should not exist. She never left that farm, never abandoned him, even when he became something other than human. And in the end, she died on her own terms, in the place she loved, with her son in the basement where he belonged. I think about her often, about the lengths a mother will go to for her child, even after death has claimed them, about the price of love and the weight of grief, and about the fact that there are houses in rural Alberta where the living and the dead share the same space, separated only by a latched door and an understanding that some things are better left undisturbed. David, wherever you are now, I hope you have found peace. And Dorothy, I hope you finally have the rest you deserve, free from the burden of protecting a son who could never truly leave home.